Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, February 10th, 2023. Our Chairman's Report this week is guest written by John Linder. Now, John was the original sponsor and proponent of the fair tax in the House and led the fight to keep the bill before Congress. He's extremely gratified that the House has agreed to submit the fair tax to an up or down vote in this session. Now, John's also starting a Substack to enhance his ability to comment on the fair tax and other issues of importance. There's no charge to join, and John invites all of you to do so. Now, here's John's article. The fair tax is back. The fair tax is back on the front burner of Congress. Thanks to the hard work of the Freedom Caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives, the Speaker has said the fair tax will get a vote in committee. Now, this, of course, has moved Democrats quickly to the front of the news cycle, declaring that a new 30% tax on gasoline, groceries, and medicine will be a tragedy for the poor. Now, this trope has been around for as long as there's been a fair tax bill. I first introduced the bill in July of 1999. Neil Bortz and I, with Rob Woodall's help, wrote 2 books responding to these arguments, but the tropes remain, and we'll respond again. Now, one of the things we learned after commissioning many studies is that there's a significant part of the price system that's represented by the embedded cost of the income tax in the IRS. More heavily manufactured products, like automobiles, may have to increase their selling prices by more than 20% because of embedded tax costs. Now, other products that don't go through as many manufacturing steps may only have increases of 10 to 15%. Now, a company has no way to pay any of their bills other than the price system, and the person who buys a product or service and uses it personally pays the labor, rent, heating, cooling, distribution, and yes, the tax costs of every company that it took to get that product to the cash register. Think about a loaf of bread. There's an oil company which gets oil out of the ground to make gasoline or diesel. There's an ore company that gets ore to sell to a steel company to make steel to sell to a manufacturer to make trucks and tractors. There's a rubber company that sells to tire companies, seed companies, farmers, bakeries, distribution companies, and grocery stores, plus many more, are all involved in getting that loaf of bread to you, and all have tax costs that you pay when you buy and consume that bread. In fact, the only taxpayer in the world is the consumer who consumes the product or service and cannot pass that cost on to others. So let's just be honest and levy the tax at that point. All the current complication is to pretend that someone else is paying the bill. Now, the fair tax eliminates the IRS, and the embedded costs get driven out of the price system, giving everyone more purchasing power. Additionally, the fair tax gives an advance to every household based on the size of that household to totally offset the cost of the fair tax up to the poverty level. Now, this is defined as the amount of spending needed for that family to buy their basic necessities. Today, that number for a family of 4 is about $39,440. Now, those living at or near the poverty level will be totally untaxed with the fair tax. So how much is the tax? It's 23% of what you spend. Now, opponents are trying to call it a 30% tax. So let's deal with that confusion. And I use that word advisedly. They are trying to confuse you. Now, there are 2 ways to treat a tax as to its impact on your personal costs. The income tax you currently pay is an inclusive tax because the tax is included in your promised pay. If you have a salary of $50,000 a year, the tax is included in that amount, and it's taken out before you even see it, and you only get what's left after the taxes have been taken. State sales taxes are treated as exclusive taxes. Now, these are on top of the cost of a good or service that you buy. If a hammer costs $10 and your state or local taxes add up to 10%, then you'll pay $11 for that $10 hammer. Now, there was a significant debate among the original founders of the fair tax whether to treat it as an exclusive tax, such as the state sales taxes are currently treated, or to treat it as an inclusive tax like the income tax. We chose to express the tax in the same way as the tax we're replacing. Now, opponents quickly jump to the worst case, 30% on top of what you spend. Then, if that's fair, it's fair to ask them to tell us what the cost of the income tax is when it's treated the same way. In other words, what percent of your income goes to the government on top of what you have left to spend. The Tax Foundation concludes that the average tax rate is 14.6% for the top 50% of taxpayers, who pay 97% of all the taxes, and it's 3.4% for the bottom 50%. The average tax rate overall is 13.3%. Additionally, all income earners pay 15.3% of their earnings in payroll taxes. Now, while half of that amount is remitted by the company that one works for, virtually every economist considers it part of the employee's earnings and thus the employee's cost. Treating the income tax exclusively, just as the opponents insist on treating the fair tax, the average of those paying 97% of all taxes is 14.6% plus 15.3 divided by 70.1, which comes out to 42.7%. Average of all, including the bottom 50%, which collectively pays about 3% of the taxes, is 13.3 plus 15.3 divided by 71.4, and that comes up to 40.1%. So, comparing both taxes as the cost of government above the cash available, we get 30% for the fair tax and over 40% for the income tax. So you decide which one's better. In conclusion, John's article clearly makes the case for why we need to enact the fair tax now. We now have the opportunity to force all members of the House to either vote for the present income payroll tax system or for the fair tax. They either support the corrupt income tax in the IRS or they want to get rid of it. It can't be any simpler than that. They either believe in being transparent and showing Americans the true cost of their government or they don't. They either support the largest transfer of power from the government to the people, the fair tax, or they don't. If they think the fair tax needs to be changed, then they can propose that change. Don't condemn the entire bill because it has a flaw in it that can be easily addressed. And don't think for a minute that there aren't any flaws in the income tax. So please stand with us and demand that your representatives support a much fairer, much simpler, and much more efficient way to fund the government, the fair tax. The fair tax doesn't pick winners and losers. Because it taxes spending, not earnings, the fair tax lets everyone save for their retirement tax-free. The fair tax collects the revenue that the federal government needs to operate, but does it in a way that has the least impact on our individual freedom and the least impact on our economic prosperity. With the fair tax, there are no tax returns to file and no records to keep. We pay our federal taxes when we make retail purchases of new goods and services, and with the fair tax, there's no need for the IRS. If you sell a used couch or a used jet ski online, there's no fair tax due on that transaction. The fair tax will allow us to take back control. The income payroll tax system is broken. It's no longer working. We can't repair it, but we can replace it with the fair tax. Join us and take back control of our country and our lives, not with bullets, but with the elimination of one of the biggest threats to our liberty and economic prosperity, the income payroll tax. We should all remember Edmund Burke's warning that applies to our efforts to take back control. Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little. We should also remember this quote from George Orwell's 1984, which, if we do nothing, may foretell your and your children's future. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. So what can each of us do? We can write letters and make calls to our elected representatives and attend Zoom town hall meetings demanding that if they really want to allow Americans to take back control, the first step is to eliminate the income payroll tax system and enact the fair tax. Take back control. Help us pass the fair tax. The IRS will be gone and we'll pay our taxes when we make purchases. We, not the ruling class and their minions in D.C., will decide how much federal tax we pay. And we'll know how much tax we're paid because taxes will no longer be hidden from us. They'll be clearly shown on every retail receipt. If you have friends who don't know about the fair tax, send them to FAIRtax.org. Have them watch the whiteboards under how it works, and if they agree, ask them to please join us. Then, contact your members of Congress and the President and demand that Congress pass the fair tax, the only truly fair tax.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.